Welcome to Now Let's Talk, the podcast with Vanessa Corwin and Kathleen Kahn, where we speak with our guests about the joys and challenges of life in today's world. Hello, I'm Vanessa Corwin.
And I'm Kathleen Kahn.
The effects of climate change on our planet go far beyond the melting of polar ice caps. In big cities like New York, where we live, the record-breaking heat waves this summer have many harmful effects on all aspects of our lives. To help us understand what's happening, Casey Ivanovich, a PhD student from Columbia Climate School in New York City, joins us. Welcome to the podcast, Casey. So let us start from the causes of this extreme heat. You know, I just have to say, I was watching the Olympics this morning from Paris, and I was watching the beach volleyball players who were playing in 94-degree heat and humidity, which means the temperature on the sand was like 100 degrees plus. And these guys were playing barefoot. So, Casey, what is causing all of this?
Sure. So in general, extreme heat can be created by a variety of different physical mechanisms. And it really depends where you are as to how those mechanisms drive these individual events. It tends to be associated in the US with sort of high pressure systems moving in. If you can imagine when you're watching the Weather Channel, for example, you can see these H's and L's where the high pressure is moving in. And so when one of those systems sits in an area for a given amount of time, that increases the temperature in those locations. So we tend to think about things like the effect of the urban heat island. So we know that certain surfaces can influence the temperatures in a given location. So if you have a lot of asphalt, if you have a lack of trees and vegetation that are providing cooling effects, you can see much higher temperatures in cities than the surrounding areas. But of course, we also know that climate change is playing an important role as we experience more frequent and intense extreme heat in the present and future climates. We have this extra intensity added to the system due to continued climate change.
Does that mean that it's not going to get better, it's just going to get worse, it sounds like? Especially explain, you just mentioned about the heat island, especially in the big cities with the asphalt. Can you talk about that a little?
Sure. So in cities, we tend to have a lot more built environment. And so we have a lot of asphalt, there's less grass cover, there's less trees and vegetation more broadly. And the vegetation itself is doing this process called evapotranspiration, which is evaporating water into the gas phase. And so that has a net cooling effect. It's very similar to the cooling effect that we have in our bodies when we evaporate sweat off the surface of our skin. Oh. So that has a net cooling impact on the air temperature. But, you know, asphalt and steel, these very dark, impervious materials are also really good at absorbing sunlight. And so they also tend to heat up a bit faster than those other materials. So both of these are contributing to having higher temperatures in cities than surrounding more rural areas or even suburban areas. And so this influences as well the way that we kind of tackle these challenges in the city. We can plant more trees, we can increase vegetation cover, we can put green roofs on buildings, all to reduce these surface temperatures, as well as, you know, using surface materials that are different colors, that are made of different materials that can reduce the amount of radiation that is really held on to.
So all this heat gets released at night, is that right? So that when the sun goes down, it doesn't really cool off that much.
That's definitely part of the challenge. That nighttime heating is a very essential part of the equation, particularly for people's experience of heat stress. We know that if people don't get kind of respite from the heat overnight, when they don't have their bodies cool down, this is something that's really dangerous for people's experience of heat stress.
So how does it affect people's health?
Based on the exposure, you can experience just, heat exhaustion or some, difficulties doing the same amount of labor or exercise, but then that can escalate very dramatically into getting heat stroke, experiencing sort of life-threatening illness.
And there are certain populations that are most vulnerable.
Absolutely. So this really depends on people's pre-existing conditions. This can differentiate by age. So we know that older individuals have less efficient sweating systems. And so this means that they can cool their bodies down less efficiently. Older individuals also tend to take more medications, which can increase their risk for heat stress. But also people who have pre-existing health conditions or have sort of comorbidities may be at greater risk for extreme heat. And so that's something that really needs to be taken into account, that the same amount of heat is not experienced equally to individuals.
I'll go to the effects that we are seeing with infrastructure and increasing energy costs. People are obviously using more air in the evening.
Yeah, so this is a really tricky issue in terms of the increasing energy demand associated with the need for more air conditioning. And this is obviously placing a higher strain on the electricity grid. I certainly have, lived in New York City in the summers where we get even push notifications on our phone urging people to turn off their air conditioning in the hours where we really need it most. So there's this really difficult relationship where the highest amount of energy strain on the grid is taking place at the highest temperatures, but that's also when people need their air conditioning the most to keep themselves safe. And so there's a real risk for power outages when the entire city is really trying to utilize all of these cooling mechanisms. And that's a major challenge that we need to face in the future. But at the same time, there's, major issues with inequality in terms of access to air conditioning. There's a lot of air conditioning installation within the city, but even people who do have air conditioning units installed, whether that's a window unit or central air, maybe aren't running their air conditioning because of the cost of utilities. And so these are major challenges in terms of the system that we have at our disposal, as well as behavioral challenges and making sure people are really able to protect themselves.
How about the effects on labor? Now, I was reading that extreme heat is said to cost the U.S. economy like about $100 billion annually, projected to increase to $500 billion. So how does this happen?
I think one of the major things we already talked about, this concept that people's, individual health conditions can impact their risk for extreme heat and heat stress. But sort of the livelihoods that people have are also a major factor in terms of how they might be affected by extreme heat. So when we think about the best ways that we can use to combat the effects of extreme heat during a heat wave, you would go inside, you would access air conditioning either in your home, or maybe you would go to a cooling center. If that is more available to you, you might go to the public library, you might go to the movie theater, somewhere that's a large space that has air conditioning access. But if you're someone who's outdoor doing construction work or agricultural production, for example, that's not necessarily an option. And so you have to be outdoors. You oftentimes have to be in the sun. You can't even seek shade in some circumstances. And further, people doing this type of work are also incentivized to push themselves as far as they can so that they don't miss wages, so that they don't get penalized in some way from their employers. And so there are major, challenges in terms of ensuring that people doing outdoor labor during heat waves are really protected from all of these, physical hazards, but also just a system which really disincentivizes protecting oneself. And so, one thing that has been suggested is shifting labor hours earlier in the day. Maybe the sun isn't out isn't as strong yet. Maybe the heat hasn't really picked up to its full capacity, but that is also something that's very challenging to work into our existing systems, as well as ensuring the safety for all of these people doing really important work.
You know, you hit a little bit on it before earlier in the conversation about what can we do to reduce the effects of extreme heat. You mentioned planting more trees and the grass on the roofs. What research is being done that can actually tell the people exactly what to do? And is using alternate energy like solar and electric cars, will that make a big difference?
Yeah, so there's some really exciting work taking place to evaluate how effective these types of interventions are. Most of this work, to my knowledge, is taking place in laboratory settings. So trying to think about how changing what we call the albedo of a surface, essentially how much radiation is being reflected or absorbed, how those kinds of changes might influence the temperatures experienced on the ground, or how planting a couple of trees might increase the evapotranspiration and thus reduce the surface temperature. But I think that the exciting developments in this research field are really the case studies that can be done in a given location. And so saying in a place like New York City, where we're really actively working to increase the amount of tree cover within the city, can we measure what the average temperatures were in the summertime, and then as soon as we implement some of these changes, really get on the ground measurements of how that is translating to reductions in surface temperature so that we can then scale them up. Could you repeat your second question?
Tell us about the difference in using alternate energy sources, such as solar and electric cars. Does that look like it's going to happen soon in the future?
So we're certainly moving towards incorporating more of these green energy sources into our systems. And I think that this really touches on an important distinction between interventions that work to reduce emissions, so sort of mitigation efforts, and then interventions that work towards adaptation. And I think for the last couple of years, we talked as if these were two kind of separate games that we had to prioritize. But what we know is that they have to happen in tandem. So while we're working to reduce the amount of emissions associated with all of these different industries, including electricity production, we also have to work towards implementing these adaptation strategies that are really necessary immediately. So in the present, we're already seeing the effects of climate change. This is true across the globe, but particularly in New York City as well. And so we really have to prioritize doing both of these at the same time.
What can you tell our listeners? What can we do to raise the awareness of the harmful effects of extreme heat in our cities? I know that there's a lot of publicity around it, but what other things we can do that is not being done?
That's a great question. So I think one of the biggest challenges with extreme heat as a climate hazard is that it's not visible. We can see a hurricane, we can see a tornado, we can see flooding, and that's not the same for extreme heat, even though it's the deadliest of all climate extremes, both within the United States and within the world more broadly. This is something that it's very sneaky. I think one of the major challenges is that there's a huge behavioral component to, protecting ourselves against extreme heat. Summers are hot in New York City. They're very muggy. We're used to that. But at the same time, we know that these extreme events are changing. We can see it. We've seen it within our lifetimes. And I think that is something that, one, we need to start discussing a bit more openly, is how we're seeing things change and how our behaviors need to change in response. But I think that one of the best things that we can do is really to check on one another. And that's a major challenge within a big city. We live in these apartment buildings. In some places, it's a very transient city to some degree. And so people don't always know their neighbors. People don't always know who needs to be checked up on, who is having conversations with their family and making sure that someone is investigating whether or not during a heat wave they're okay. And so I think another major sort of vulnerability of older adults in this country is that they oftentimes don't have the social networks that allow them to be safe. And so what we really need is to work more on building community, and in these really essential high risk times, making sure that the people around us have what they need, have access to air conditioning, have proper hydration, and that we really, protect each other in these really difficult times.
That's wonderful.
That's excellent. That's excellent advice. And I think just the very fact that we live in New York, where we don't often know our neighbors, I think that's so important.
There's so many resources in this city. And so we know, particularly in New York City, there's a wide array of cooling centers that are available. So they can go to the public libraries, they can go to movie theaters, but there are also these individual cooling centers that are put in place for, heat wave events. But there's been some really awesome work, particularly done by We Act, which is a local environmental justice group, which has shown that people don't know that people don't know that these cooling centers are available. They don't know when they're supposed to use them, or they have major concerns about why they don't want to go during a heat wave event. And so I think really meeting people where they're at, listening to these valid concerns and trying to ameliorate so that people can utilize the systems that are already there and that could really provide essential benefits during these high risk periods. They have some really great environmental justice work that's ongoing, and they particularly have an extreme heat group that works on a lot of these issues.
Excellent.
Oh, yeah.
Excellent. And are there, other than We Act, are there other websites or other organizations that people might go to?
That's a great question. I think it's always good to check in with any kind of city government web pages. They're very active in terms of posting when heat advisories are happening or heat warnings are happening and giving advice on sort of what actions are necessary. But I think that is also another moment where we need to meet people where they're at in terms of, I even know that sometimes those warnings are very difficult to read. Sometimes, before I got into this field, especially, I didn't know what the difference was between an advisory, between a warning, and how the different actions would be necessary. And so there's definitely ongoing work sort of in the social sciences to think about how we can better communicate this to people, make it very clear. And I think that that's a major area of continued work. I think that there's also another major challenge is a behavioral aspect in terms of, people self-identifying particularly as high risk. So there's been some interesting work that has come out recently showing that individuals are very unlikely to label themselves as a high risk group for heat stress. And so this could be due to age, for example. So there's been some really interesting interviews where individuals will say, well, I know that, elderly people tend to be higher risk for heat stress, but I'm okay because I'm healthy. And I can totally, I can empathize with that kind of feeling that you're like, well, I know my body, I feel fine, I know what to do, and it'll be okay. And so even though these are sort of physiologically defined risk factors, it can be really difficult for individuals to recognize that maybe they are one of these high risk groups. And so I think that kind of communication work is also really important to improve upon, and to be really gentle with people and making sure that they don't feel scared and that they don't feel attacked in some way or, have any of these kind of negative connotations with being in these groups, but to at the same time make sure that they know that they're aware of what they need to do and how to stay safe.
After hearing what you're saying, I think we need to congratulate the local weatherman because they're on top of it all the time and they do tell people. I guess the hard part is they have to inform. They can't say you cannot go out if you're blah, blah. So, but they do a great job.
Yeah, it's definitely a hard balance.
So, Casey, this has been really, really great. So informative. Thank you so much.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to hear from you, so please visit our website at nowletstalkthepodcast.com and send us your comments and questions. We'll see you next time.